all the time.
Okay,
Dazza, let's go.
Dazza, GPS. I know GPS is real because the stars are exactly the way they say, and so satellites must be exactly what I was told, even though it can't be.
You guys should cook for like an hour. Let's go. Let's do. You guys should cook. You and Dazza.
No, I don't want to hear Dazza just reassert that it must be real. That doesn't really do any good.
But he's so confident sounding. At least he sounds like he's.
He really does sound good. He does, Dazza. You have an intelligent. I know you're intelligent, but your tone and your delivery makes you sound like it might be real just because of the way you say it. I think you're a true believer, even.
It's real. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah, I know that. See what I'm saying, everybody? That sounded good.
So there's a lot of not wanting to sidetrack the GPS, but you did bring it up. There's a lot of misinformation. People are outright lying about what it is and how it behaves. So,
shots fired.
At least that needs addressing.
Well, Dazza, we've already been through it. Planes can't land if there's a tangential gradient. And I'm not going to get into the argument with you right now, but I mean, you have to agree, if I'm right, that they don't have any way of accounting for the tangential velocity and they'd be landing on a moving surface, then you'd have to agree, if I'm right, it's just take that as an if, then it wouldn't work, right? The ball would effectively be debunked because planes land all the time without having to worry about that.
So my perspective on this is that it doesn't matter whether the Earth is moving or not, planes don't have to compensate for it, provided they maintain their relative velocity with the surface to some reasonable speed, and which they do. They never exceed their ground speed never exceeds a particular value because they're limited by the air. So an aircraft can't tell if the Earth is moving basically under normal circumstances.
Yeah, so either the Earth's not moving, or there's some kind of tangential velocity adjustment that they don't make, but happens without them knowing it's happening.
I like to start with the scenario of driving a car, right? If you drive a car along the Earth and the Earth was rotating, you wouldn't know, right?
Yeah, but it's totally a non sequitur. One's on the Earth and one is detached. No, it's not the same. You want to think of it that way because the Earth isn't moving, and you can just say it's like being in a car where it doesn't matter if the Earth is moving. But the reason we talk about conserved momentum or Coriolis or any of these things is because if the Earth was a ball, those things would have to apply with a detached, airbound plane or anything else. I don't think the Coriolis applies to planes at all, right? Because that's just for one straight trajectory. Because it has engines, and because it's in the air moving and going wherever it wants, you can throw Coriolis out the window. It has nothing to do with Coriolis. But that doesn't take away from the fact that if it flies to the equator, it's going to land on a surface that's moving faster than where it took off from, eastward. And the plane's not made to speed up eastward and fly straight in any other direction it wants to.
But how much speed over what time does it have to pick up relative to the ground or relative to the air? So if you assume the globe model is true and the air is more or less rotating with the globe, how much speed from an external point of view does it have to pick up between the North Pole and the equator?
Okay. Let me just put this.
And simple. Over how
First
long?
Of all, the air, more saying. Wait, first of all, saying more or less isn't even good enough. That's not even good enough. Even if the air were carrying the plane faster eastward, backwards or sideways or whatever it needs to do, even if the air were able to do that, even though there's no dynamic mechanism within the air to make that happen, and we have winds going in all the other directions. So even if it was as good as it could possibly get, more or less is not even good enough because it has to be so perfectly in sync. The pilot just thinks it's a stationary Earth or pretends that he's landing on a perfectly stationary Earth, not a more or less stationary Earth.
So if the pilot was... so let's say the Earth wasn't rotating, it's just moving through space at 1,000 miles an hour. If the pilot was about to land on the Earth, and he was also traveling through space at 1,000 miles an hour, plus less his, or plus or minus his airspeed or ground speed. How would he even know that the thing was moving through space at 1,000 miles per hour?
You're saying if they happen to be moving at the exact same rate, how would he know? Well, the thing is, it wouldn't be moving at the exact same rate. You would have to have a mechanism that makes the plane accelerate from it, like take your most extreme that you've pointed out yourself. If it takes off from the North Pole, where there's no tangential velocity that's going to be imparted onto the plane. Let's just say it was 200 to give you something, right? So we've got a 200 mile per hour eastward tangential velocity, conserved momentum. Even if he kept the 200, which is fantasy already, because why would he still be going eastward 200 miles an hour when he's been traveling west southwest for hours and hours and hours? You think the plane's just automatically still moving eastward along with the rotation, even that extra 200 miles an hour, backwards and sideways as it's traveling west southwest? You can imagine it and kinematically just put it on paper, but there's no force to make that happen. And he has to be going 1,000 miles an hour. Where's the extra 800 miles per hour directly eastward momentum going to be added to this plane without the pilots being aware of that or having to deal with that or anything? There's no way that that's possibly even happening. Even if you could say the air was more or less in sync, the air is not accelerating the plane eastward as it's traveling against the spin in the opposite direction. That makes no sense. It's not that I don't understand it. It makes literally no dynamic possible way for that to be even plausible. How's it going to land on 1,000 mile an hour rotation, right? If we agree that it's supposed to be traveling eastward at 1,000 miles an hour at the equator, that means we agree that the plane would have to be going eastward at 1,000 miles an hour in perfect sync with the ground once it gets there somehow, even though it's only going forward at maybe 200 miles an hour and maybe doing big loops. It's got no destination. There's nothing to correct for. It's just a joyriding pilot. He's going to land in a clearing wherever he feels like it. Okay. After he's done loops around all over the place, he's not correcting for anything. The air's not pushing him eastward faster and faster as he goes towards the equator. Even if the air were able to do that, more or less wouldn't be good enough to put him in perfect sync.
Okay, so let's go back to the to the Earth just simply moving through space without rotating. So let's say there's an aircraft on the runway.
Hold on, wait. Do you agree with the premises of what I was just talking about? The plane would have to be moving eastward, right? No, it wouldn't have to be moving eastward at 1,000 miles an hour to be in sync with the Earth?
It's rotating, yeah. But you never,
rotating at 1,000 miles an hour, so the plane has to be rotating at 1,000 miles an hour eastward, even if it's going forward at a different speed, right? You have to agree on what the globe model says here. Not making anything up to straw man it. That's what the globe model says.
From an external inertial observer that sees the Earth rotating, they would see the aircraft also increasing its tangential velocity, yes.
I don't care about why are you trying to put it as somebody looking at the Earth?
All the aircraft
literally 1,000 miles an hour
relative to the air and the ground. It's not aware that it's accelerating.
But regardless if he's aware of it, you're agreeing that the plane would have to accelerate. It started at the North Pole. The plane would somehow have to be moving eastward at 1,000 miles an hour for the pilot to have no idea that the Earth is moving separately from him eastward, right? So the plane would have to be moving backwards if he's facing westward. The plane has to now be moving backwards with the rotation perfectly, even if he's facing westward and slowing down in that direction. The plane has to continue moving at the exact same rate at the equator to land on the surface as if it's stationary. Do we agree on that?
So the plane always...
Regardless of how you think it happens, do we agree that would have to happen?
So the plane always has to maintain... it can never get slower than the surface of the Earth by whatever his airspeed is, right? He always has to maintain that speed. And
what do you mean?
That speed inertially is increasing as he gets to the equator, then his inertial speed will be increasing.
No, wait, hold on, wait. Are you talking about what the pilot does?
No, I'm just saying what the plane does. The plane will have to. If the plane... So this is why I want to go back to the beginning and just talk about some simple cases.
You're agreeing that the plane would have to be moving at 1,000 miles an hour eastward as it's at the equator.
1,000 miles an hour relative to an inertial observer that sees the Earth rotating. Relative to the Earth...
Why are you talking about relative? Right? Is it literally supposed to be spinning at 1,000 miles around there, 1,000 miles an hour at the equator? Is it literally, regardless of your relativity ideas, is it literally said to be moving at 1,000 miles an hour at the equator?
Compared to an inertial observer, it is, yes.
Okay, regardless if you... Why do you have to put that qualifier in there?
Because that's the nature of the rotation.
What do you mean, the nature of the rotation? Okay, regardless if you can make it... Okay, you want to make it relative to something else. It's literally 1,000 miles an hour compared to 0 miles an hour at the poles, or in this situation, 200 miles an hour eastward where it took off from. So the plane was moving, we can pretend, at 200 miles an hour eastward. And the reason we even talk about conserved momentum is because the plane's not attached to the Earth any longer. So the conserved momentum would keep him rotating, but that's only because he was on the Earth, not because he's in the air. The conserved momentum comes from being on the Earth, like your car.
Okay, so let's try some simpler scenarios, right? It gets complicated when it's rotating. So if we start with an Earth...
That's the problem.
So let's start with an Earth that is just shoveling through space at 1,000 miles an hour, right? It can be planar, it can be whatever you like. We've got an aircraft on the runway, and the runway is facing at right angles to that velocity. What's going to happen when the aircraft takes off? Nothing, right? It's just going to be flying relative to the ground. Because the air and the Earth, the aircraft, all start off with that initial velocity. They're all moving that way. All the aircraft is aware of its changes in momentum. Its absolute momentum has no bearing in this situation. All it's really aware of is its changes in momentum, and it's not getting any changes in momentum as it takes off, other than other than the speed it's gathered by actually getting into the air. So it's flying around.
Wait, hold on. You're talking about the pilot's aware of? Pilot's aware of nothing going eastward. The pilot takes off, and he has like whatever conserved momentum from being on the ground. He gets to the air, and he's flying in any direction he wants, maybe only 100 miles an hour. He's in a Cessna, let's say. He's only going 100 miles an hour forward. He can do whatever he wants, but somehow he might still believe he's on a ball, and then he would have to, in the back of his mind, think, I'm still rotating from being on the ground. I'm still rotating to the Earth somewhat, but then the friction of the air would take away from the conserved momentum quite a bit. I'm sorry, I was talking. Did you want to talk too?
Yeah, you're getting too far ahead before we finish with the initial problem. So we'll go back to your Cessna on this mythical Earth shuffling through space at 1,000 miles an hour. So he takes off in his little Cessna. He's flying around. All he's aware of are his changes in momentum that he sees. So when he's got to do a turn, he's got to change his momentum. But at no given time does his speed relative to the ground reflect the fact that he's traveling through space with another 1,000 miles an hour under his belt, right? He's not aware of that.
Well, wait a minute. Hold on, wait. When you say momentum, you're not talking about the conserved momentum of the rotation of the Earth now, are you?
No, so this is a non-rotating case to start with, right? So he's just...
okay, that's why you threw me off.
So the Earth...
Why are you talking about space? Let's just keep it to Earth. Why are you talking about space?
Because our Earth, in this case, the Earth is traveling through space at 1,000 miles an hour, right? Not tangentially.
Oh, so you're talking about a stationary Earth, a non-rotating Earth going through space.
No, I'm talking about an Earth that is just moving through space, translating through space at 1,000 miles an hour. It's not rotating. It's just, we can consider it a flat Earth.
Right, of course.
Moving through Earth at 1,000 miles, moving through space at 1,000 miles an hour, right?
Why don't you just keep it to reality? Planes flying over a rotating Earth. Why do you have to make this other scenario that doesn't have anything? The problem?
Because we start with the simple physics, and then we build on the complexities as we go, making sure we understand the simple cases first. So you would agree that if the Earth was flat, if the Earth was flat and simply moving through space at 1,000 miles an hour, the pilot wouldn't know or care about that, right?
I don't know. That would be a scenario that you'd actually have. That would make, I mean, who knows what the effects of traveling through space would be. Okay, wait. Is there a container?
It doesn't matter. We can just assume.
It would.
So we've just got our large flat Earth and the air above it all moving through space at 1,000 miles an hour together.
But you know what? Let me just if you want to go with this, right? You go ahead and talk. Don't ask me any questions. Build your scenario. I'll just listen. Build it up to the plane landing on the runway that's moving 1,000 miles an hour, and how the plane is moving in direct sync eastward with the 1,000 miles an hour. Just get there. Go ahead and build. I'll just listen. Go ahead.
All right. Okay. So we're starting off with our flat plane Earth with the air sitting on top, all moving through space at 1,000 miles an hour compared to somebody else on the outside who's not moving at 1,000 miles an hour. The pilot would take off. He would just fly around. He's not aware that he's traveling 1,000 miles an hour because his momentum from that external point of view doesn't matter. All that matters to him is the changes he has to make to his momentum to turn, to slow down, to speed up, to land on the ground. So at the time that he lands, the fact that he's landing sideways to that velocity of the Earth makes no difference because his velocity is also carrying that component in that direction. He's not aware of it because there's nothing to tell him he's moving sideways. He's just coming in to land. It's like flying a drone in an aircraft. The air is moving with the aircraft. You can fly the drone around as though the aircraft is not moving. So do we agree on this so far that the Earth in that case would be like flying a drone in an aeroplane?
Okay, you're saying it's a stationary Earth, but whatever the Earth is, the whole system is contained, and there's no way to, it's like inside of an airplane where there's like a complete sealing of all the air in, and it's got a container that's like making sure that there's no drift from the space that it's flying through at 1,000 miles an hour affecting it. So it's like being on a drone inside an airplane, which relatively isn't moving because it's contained, and you can just treat it as stationary and it's not rotating. Okay, so now you're going to build up to the plane being like a ball with a tangential gradient. Go ahead.
Yeah, okay. So where we are now is we have an aircraft flying around above an Earth that is moving at 1,000 miles an hour compared to somebody else's perspective. And we agree he can do it. He should be able to do it with no problems, right? Because we can actually prove this by doing a drone flight in an aircraft at 1,000 miles an hour. The drone makes no compensation for the fact the aircraft is moving. So now we'll look at it in the globe Earth case. Let's assume that we've taken off at the equator and we've got this rotational velocity of 1,000 miles an hour compared to this external observer that sees everything rotating at 1,000 miles an hour. Aircraft can't tell the difference in this case because the angular speed is very low. It might as well be on that flat stationary plane because everything is rotating together at 1,000 miles an hour. So it takes off, sits there, flies around, comes back to land, independent of what that velocity, tangential velocity is, right? Because he's never separated from the ground speed by more than his flight speed. So he can just do what he likes and lands where he likes, as though everything was stationary. So does that still make sense?
You're saying that if he stayed on the latitude where it was 1,000 miles an hour, you could pretend that he's still moving eastward at 1,000 miles an hour indefinitely. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. Because he's flying around.
If he goes to a different latitude, then he's got to somehow adjust so that he's going at that speed instead, right?
Okay, yep. So we can start at the equator. We've got 1,000 miles an hour, and let's say we're going to the North Pole. And that takes us 11 hours, say, or 10 hours for the simplicity of the maths. So over that 10 hours, we've got to drop 1,000 miles an hour of tangential velocity, which on average is 100 miles an hour every hour, which is only 1 or 2 miles an hour every minute. It's a very small acceleration, right, that can be provided by the drag force from the wind. So we'll assume that same deal, that there's a perfectly still Earth, there's no wind, the air and the ground move in sync. So the pilot will just fly. He'll be following his ground track, but there'll be an almost imperceptible side wind that over every hour adds a little bit to his speed from the outside, but to the ground speed it adds nothing, which is why he doesn't see it. And he gets to the pole.
Okay, now let me just ask about these winds. Let me just ask about the winds. You said the drag force. Are you talking about real winds or imaginary winds?
So this is imagining that the air is perfectly still. We've got a day where there are no winds.
Oh, so there's no wind. Okay, so then what's the wind that's slowing him down, the dragging, if there's no wind?
So it's because he's moving, the air is rotating with the Earth and he's moving perpendicular to that rotation, there will be a force applied to his aircraft. A slight drag force.
But you said wind. You said wind.
Well,
dragging from the wind.
Yeah. Well, it's probably not wind. There's drag from the air.
Well, probably.
Because his aircraft's mass will be trying to go in a straight line and the wind is rotating a little bit and he'll be getting a bit of drag. So there'll be an
Wait, you said there was no wind. Why'd you say the wind is rotating?
Well, when I'm saying wind, I'm meaning that his aircraft will have speed relative to the air. So there's no airspeed relative to the ground, just airspeed relative to his aircraft. So if you consider his aircraft,
we're talking about a precise thing. Like if he's got to be slowing down to 200 miles an hour eastward, this is about a precision. I mean, he's got to just treat it perfectly stationary. So whatever the wind that's not a wind, that's on a perfectly still day, that's somehow not affected by all the other real winds you have to contend with. Why is this such a perfect, precise thing that, I mean, if you try to convince a pilot that there's this imaginary wind that's going to make him in sync with the Earth and otherwise he'd be screwed, he'd laugh at you. Even if he thought it was a globe, he'd just be laughing.
Okay. So would you also agree then that a pilot, if it is a windy day, not so windy that he's got to fly sideways, but say there's he's got his Cessna, he can do 150 knots, and there's a 15-knot crosswind, that he would be able to maintain his track on the ground. If it was only a 2-knot...
Yeah, that's why I make my scenario, really, just to make sure. There is no ground path for my scenario, right? That's why I make it that way. Because usually people try to think about it as the air. The air doesn't, even if it's a still day, the air, if it's a perfectly still day, that means that the air is in perfect sync with the Earth and that there's no wind. But This is also the same wind that's going to accelerate the plane, real wind.
Yeah.
And then once I put that to him, they're like, okay, all right, let's make it about the ground path. That's why I make my scenario. He takes off at a 500 mile per hour, conserve momentum. You can keep that conserved momentum, even though the resistance would take a lot of that away immediately. But let's just say somehow the plane is going eastward at 500 miles per hour indefinitely, right? He's going to keep that eastward conserved momentum, even if he does big loops. Now, this is a joy-riding pilot. He's got no ground. He's got no ground path. Listen, he's got no ground path to correct. The reason, hold on, wait, this is very important. The reason I make the scenario that he's got no ground path is any pilot could go on a joyride, right, and do whatever he wants, do big loops all over the place, and land wherever he wants and treat the Earth as perfectly stationary. It doesn't have anything to do with the ground track to make him speed up or slow down.
Okay. So in that case, if he's just flying around randomly, the plane will behave as follows. The plane will be applying thrust and lift and it will have drag. The plane's speed relative to the ground will be a result of the thrust and the lift and the drag plus the wind speed. So you'll end up with a speed relative to the ground that's a combination of all of those things. And basically he can't exceed, or he can't get any different to ground speed based on his flight speed, right? So if his aircraft,
how do you know that?
So
how do you know that? Because the Earth is spinning twice as fast as where he took off from. So why are you saying he can't get out of sync?
So if the guy's plane is going flat out right at 150 knots, and the air is moving at 200 knots, because he's in a wind, his ground speed will be 350 knots, right? Does that make sense?
No, but no. If it's a rotating Earth, that throws it all off.
Wait, you don't have to worry about the rotation.
The ground speed is the air is the speed of the plane relative to a stationary surface. If it was relative to a moving surface with a tangential gradient, we would have a totally different reading of what we call ground speed, because there would be a tangential gradient, and that would throw it all off. You would have to compare moving 100 miles an hour forward, west-southwest, over a ground that's moving 500 miles an hour, compared to when he's at the equator. Now the ground's moving at 1,000 miles. So that ground speed is totally dependent upon this tangential gradient then, if it were moving. No. But then what we call ground speed, the ground speed is the air's movement compared to the stationary ground, not a tangential velocity ground.
The ground speed is how fast you're moving compared to the ground.
The stationary ground.
No.
If it was a tangential, if it was moving different, if the ground were moving at different speeds from where he took off from to where he's landing, it wouldn't be the ground any longer. It would be the ground at 1,000 miles an hour, or ground at 500 or 200. That would throw it all off.
Real quick, Pazza, you know those walkways at the airport that, it's like a long walkway? If you had one that was going a little faster than the other, and the next one that was going a little faster, you have multiple different speed grounds. And then if you only had one air mass speed, there's a mismatch there.
Yes, yeah. But I think a better scenario might be walking across a merry-go-round at the playground. That as you're moving...
Walking across, no. When you're attached to it, it's a non sequitur. When you're on the ground, it's not at all the same. You don't talk about conserved momentum. You don't talk about Coriolis or conserved momentum or any of those things when you're attached to it, on it in a car or inside a plane, when you're in one reference frame. Because there's two reference frames that aren't connected any longer, we have to talk about conserved momentum. And at one latitude, then pretend that it just stays with it, right? And he can just land as if he's still going eastward. But when you have the tangential velocity gradient, you can't just pretend he's in sync again.
Okay, so if we go back to our still day and we're in a hot air balloon, would we expect us to stay in the same place?
What are you talking about?
So if we had a hot air balloon on a still day, would we just sit in the same place above the Earth?
Depends on what the hot air balloon's doing as far as its propulsion, and it can direct itself.
There's no propulsion in a hot air balloon. They're completely at mercy of the wind. They can go up and down, but that's all. So we've got a perfectly still day. With the hot air balloon stay relative, have the same zero speed.
On a stationary Earth like it is, I would assume so. But if the Earth were actually moving, I don't know what would happen.
Well, why would it move? And how fast would it move?
If the globe Earth says the Earth is rotating eastward, that's why.
Okay, so let's go back to our flat Earth doing 1,000 miles an hour through space. Would the hot air balloon stay in the same position above the flat Earth?
I have no idea, because is it a contained flat Earth? Is all the air contained like inside the airplane? Is it all contained with something solid?
It wouldn't have to be solid. You've got a vacuum around the outside. That's irrelevant. That we've got a still.
It would have to be if there's a vacuum around the outside. It would have to be a solid container.
Yeah. So it doesn't. But we'll go there. No, that's another conversation. So if we'll go back to our aircraft analogy. So our aircraft's traveling at 1,000 miles an hour. Would a helium balloon released in the aircraft just stay in the same position?
Depends on, if there's any other conditions inside it. Are you talking about like a static air where it like?
Yeah, just a
I don't
static
know
air.
why is that helping your point? Get to your point.
What I'm trying to say is that there's enough that the air can carry things along with it, right? So if we were to give the balloon a shove,
you're just imagining. You're saying if it's a still day and the hot air balloon just staying stationary, then it must be rotating with the Earth, or the Earth is stationary, right? So you can just say it must be moving with the Earth. I don't know. I guess because we believe the Earth is moving, then it's moving with the Earth. But when you have a tangential gradient down, which is the point you still haven't addressed, and you're tiptoeing around it, the ground's moving faster where it lands. You have to have a mechanism that makes the plane move faster eastward, no matter which direction it flies, how fast it flies, wherever it wants to go, doing big loops. If it's doing big loops, Dazza, you have to imagine that it's now going left, right? The left side of the plane is going faster eastward, and then it turns around. Now it's going faster to the right side of the plane, and this imaginary still wind is somehow affecting the plane. There would be so many things that the pilot would have to deal with if there was an acceleration on the plane, making it go twice as fast by the time it lands. So it breaks your model. It breaks your model, Dazza. Sorry, it breaks it.
So here's the interesting thing about acceleration and momentum, right? So if you are rotating or accelerating in a small circumference, like an aircraft doing a small loop, right? Flying around in a tight circle. That angular momentum and changing momentum is all the pilot feels. He wouldn't be aware of any other linear momentum that he may be carrying. He's only aware of the changes in momentum. And so somebody observing that plane from the outside...
When you talk about momentum, momentum that like conserve momentum from being on the ground?
So momentum is
when you talk about
velocity, right?
Okay, so the pilot knows that he's flying forward. That's all the pilot knows. He can bank right, bank left, right? But that's just all the pilot is concerned with is flying forward at 200, 300, 400 miles an hour. There's no acceleration of him going eastward that he's aware of whatsoever. And he would be if it was twice as fast where he's landing.
So he's not aware of it because it happens so slowly, right? So he's got 10 hours to build up 1,000 k's of
really?
velocity.
I mean, that's the idea, but
how much
he's doing big loops. Dude, he's doing big loops all over the place. You have to imagine the air that's like imparting it's imparting its acceleration on the left side of the plane, then it's doing it the right side. What if he has to circle the airport at 1,000 miles an hour airport, right? And that airport's moving twice as fast as the one he took off from. He's circling for, good 45 minutes while he's getting clearance to land. Are you imagining that the air is carrying him perfectly in sync as he's doing these circles at 100 miles an hour and then slowing down to a land still? The air is carrying him backwards or sideways or whatever it needs to do. You're just imagining that.
So
imagining it doesn't. So the pilot would be aware of it. It would be a hazard. You got people's lives in the hands of him directing the plane forward and landing it safely. If you were trying to convince him that the air is carrying him twice as fast as where he took off, like I said, if he believed in the globe, even if he believed in the globe, he knows that's not happening. And there'd be no mechanism, no physical way for that to happen. Imagining it doesn't make it physically possible, that's for sure.
So we agreed before that he'd be unaware if he had 1,000 kilometers an hour velocity from some external perspective, right?
I don't know. That would have to happen for us to know if he'd be aware of it or not.
We know that it's the case, right? Because if you look at the aeroplane case with a drone flying around in an aircraft, we know from that scenario that we don't have to alter the way we operate the drone because we have 1,000 miles an hour of velocity compared to the Earth, right?
If you have a contained one reference frame thing, I mean, you're comparing it I don't know why you want to compare apples to oranges to make this seem possible.
Because
we're just talking about oranges. We're not talking about apples.
So a reference frame is only a point of view for analysis, right? And you pick one to make it easy to analyze. So what you're trying to do is say that the aircraft is an inertial object, just flying unimpacted by any other.
I'm not trying to do anything. I'm just saying what the globe model says. The globe model says it's 1,000 miles an hour to the equator, and the globe model says that the plane is in a separate reference frame. So what's the disconnect? Why can't you just admit that it wouldn't work? I'm not trying to do anything. I'm just saying this is a contradiction, a direct thing that would have to happen, and there's a test being done every minute of the day that the plane lands without having to worry about it. And there's no mechanism to make them in sync.
I don't think we're going anywhere with this. Yeah. So the mechanism.
I feel like you're able to admit it. I guess I'm putting you in the position of having to admit there is no answer, and you're putting me in the position of having to accept that there must be an answer. Let me just talk about this perspective or reference frames and inside planes, which is all these non sequiturs. There's no mechanism to make the plane in sync so we can treat the Earth as stationary when it's moving faster or slower from where he took off from.
But he's not moving faster or slower relative to the ground.
No, his forward motion has nothing to do with it, right? The plane's forward motion has nothing to do with this eastward acceleration.
His velocity is his velocity, right? It doesn't matter. If his velocity relative to the ground, if the magnitude of it is less than, is limited, which it is, he can't make any arbitrary ground speed, right? Because he gets limited by airspeed, and airspeed is limited by wind speed. So the fastest he can possibly go relative to the ground is just airspeed plus wind speed, right?
No. Hold on, wait. We need to agree on this. They're mutually exclusive. His forward motion has nothing to do with the eastward tangential velocity gradient. Can we agree on that?
Well, his velocity has two components. If you're looking at it from the outside, it'll have the north-south component and the east-west component. And from an external observer that sees the Earth rotating under them, he will, as he gets to the equator, his velocity component will have the Earth's velocity component as well as his forward component.
What? No, okay.
Yeah.
No wonder. Okay, so wait. When he takes off at the 500 mile per hour area where we pretend that he's moving with the Earth even though he's detached from the Earth, right? He's moving 100 miles an hour forward. Does that 100 miles an hour forward affect the conserved momentum of 500 miles an hour that we pretend is there?
So his momentum is the momentum he has at takeoff. And momentum depends on your reference frame as well, okay? So because it's mass times velocity, and velocity is not preserved between a rotating reference frame and an inertial one. So
okay, yeah, because you're saying, wait, is that a more complicated sounding way of saying the 500 miles per hour that we pretend the plane's moving eastward with the ground when it takes off would dissipate as soon as he gets in the air because of the friction and moving out, actually accelerating in the opposite direction? Is that what you were saying?
No.
So the 500 miles per hour, he wouldn't just continue to move 500 miles an hour eastward. That would be like very, very much less when he's moving. If he's flying west-southwest against the spin, he's not going to continue moving eastward at 500 miles an hour as well as going forward at 100 miles an hour spin, right?
So
you could pretend he is, but you could pretend he is all the way up to 1,000 miles an hour. But how are you going to pretend he's moving 1,000 miles an hour once he gets to the equator? Pretending it doesn't make it so.
If he takes off against the spin at the equator, his speed...
No, I just stick to my scenario, Dazza. He's got the 500 mile per hour latitude he takes off from. He flies to the equator against the spin west-southwest. He's got no aim. He's got no direction. He's not corrected for anything. But the plane has to now be moving at 1,000 miles an hour backwards when he's landing against the spin and slowing down. How is the plane moving backwards at 1,000 miles an hour? What's the mechanism? Not that I think you have an answer. I'm just showing everyone listening that there is no answer.
So if he is flying just on a constant bearing at a constant airspeed, his ground speed will be determined by the wind speed.
The ground speed is wait. So you're saying the ground speed
relative to
at 1,000 miles an hour, not the ground speed at 500 miles an hour, because there's two different ground speeds, like Gio pointed out.
So you're confusing speed from somebody observing from the outside against. So the ground speed of the plane is the speed relative to the surface, right? So if he was to look down,
wait, hold on, wait, relative to a moving surface, relative to a faster moving surface, or just relative to a stationary surface?
It's just
the ground speed is station. It's relative to ground speed is relative to a stationary surface.
Okay, so you're talking about his inertial speed.
No, I'm talking about the speed of the ground being different at the equator, bro. You can't just call it ground speed. Ground speed is the plane's movement forward compared to the stationary surface below it. If it was a moving surface, we wouldn't call it the ground speed any longer. We would call it ground speed relative to the new speed of the ground.
Okay, so can we then come up with some terms we can agree on? So your ground speed is what I call speed relative to an inertial observer. Somebody from the outside.
Not my ground. This is Dazza, I'm not trying to make anything up or confuse anything or confuse anybody. The ball model says the Earth would be moving faster. The ball model also says the speed of the plane is relative to a stationary surface.
No,
even though it'd be moving faster.
The plane is relative to the ground.
So to the ground that's not moving, to the ground that's stationary, right?
Okay, so you understand that it makes no difference if you've got a velocity compared to. So you've got three people, right? So one guy's on the outside. He thinks he's not moving. He's got no evidence that he's moving. He sees the Earth rotating, and he says, "Oh, that Earth is rotating. The surface is going past at 1,000 miles an hour there at the equator." And we've got someone on the surface of the Earth that takes off, and all they can see is how fast they're going compared to the surface of the Earth. They don't understand that they're actually traveling 1,000 miles an hour compared to that guy on the outside who's watching them. So the aircraft only knows about its speed compared to the ground and to the
stationary ground. Whether you think it's moving or not, we can both agree that the pilot doesn't have to worry about a moving ground.
No, he doesn't.
The pilot just treats the Earth as stationary. He flies point to point. He never has to chase the target. He just flies from one place to another, even though the ball model says where he's flying to would be moving faster. The ground speed, which is his movement forward to where he's landing, is relative to what they treat and is stationary for all intents and purposes, right?
No. So
if it was a moving ground, that would be a different rate altogether. He would have to then compare his speed forward to a ground moving at 1,000 miles an hour eastward compared to the 500 mile per hour ground that he left from. That's the point, Dazza. You can't pretend that's not a problem.
So we discussed before how if he's flying along relative to a ground moving 1,000 miles an hour, he doesn't know or doesn't care how fast the whole system is moving, right?
No, he would. Wait, 1,000 miles an hour compared to where he took off at 500 miles an hour, he would have to care if it were moving at 1,000 miles an hour. Why don't you just stick to the scenario that I'm pointing out? You're skirting away from my scenario to let's think about it this way, rather than just saying you're right. It'd be moving 500 miles faster, and somehow he would have to account for that. There's no mechanism to make that happen, and he treats it as stationary, so therefore no globe.
He's moving at 500 miles an hour faster from the point of view of somebody watching him from the outside that can see the Earth rotating.
Well, now you make it sound like it's not actually happening.
So from his perspective, all he can see is how fast he's going compared to the wind and how fast he's going compared to the ground.
to the stationary ground. If it was moving, he would have a problem. That's the issue. If it was moving faster than where he took off from, there would be so many complications that the plane would have to have a totally different design. It would have to be made to accelerate in one direction as it's moving forward in another. Everything would be completely off. The ground has to be stationary. That's why they call it a ground speed. It's in relation to what is treated and in all intents and purposes completely stationary. If it was moving at a different rate, that we wouldn't even have the same readings. It would be relative to a surface that's moving either faster or slower, depending on where he flies. And that's just basics, dude.
So how does an aircraft measure its ground speed?
What difference does it make? It's stationary, bro.
No, it's important. How does an aircraft measure its ground speed? You're not too technical, just approximately.
It's just his acceleration forward. However fast he's moving forward, that's called the ground speed.
Yeah, but how would he measure it? Just hypothetically.
How would he measure it?
Yeah, with a radar.
Looks at the dashboard. He sees he's going 100 miles, 400 miles an hour.
No. How would it work in some kind of theoretical sense? Like, would it be measuring, like a radar or something like that, measuring the speed of the ground going underneath, or?
What's your point? Just get to your point. Why are you asking that?
So the point is that all he can measure is how fast he's going compared to the ground. He can have
stationary ground.
All he knows about is
compared to a stationary ground. Yes, regardless if you think it's moving, the pilot is moving relative to what is thought of and is treated as stationary. Yes or no?
It's treated as stationary, yes, because any changes in velocity from an external point of view are so small the pilot wouldn't be aware of them over time.
We're talking about twice as fast as where he took off from. Just saying it would be so small from an outside perspective view doesn't change the fact that the globe model says it would literally be moving twice as fast as where he took off from. Just saying it wouldn't be noticed because it's relatively small is ridiculous. It'd be moving twice as fast.
So we
literally
talked about
the globe model, it would be.
Yeah,
so
but it's gradual.
Yeah, and we talked about it a minute ago that the pilot is unaware that he's flying above a surface that might be moving at 1,000 miles an hour from somebody else's perspective, right?
What do you mean? If it was moving faster than where he took off, he'd be well aware of that because he wouldn't be able to land on it.
Wait. If the ground was moving 1,000 miles an hour and he was traveling with it at 200 miles an hour faster than the ground, all he would be aware of is that he was traveling 200 miles an hour. He wouldn't know that everything is moving at 1,000 miles an hour on top of that. Okay.
Yes, he would. If it was moving twice as fast as where he took off from, he would know it. He wouldn't be able to treat it as stationary. It wouldn't be stationary. It would be moving. That's how he would know it.
So ignoring the in-between bit, can we agree at takeoff, he's not aware of how fast he's moving relative to space, right? He's not aware that he's got 500
Why are you talking about space? Look, he takes off. He knows how fast he's moving. He doesn't have to worry about the ground moving because it's not moving. If it were moving, he would have to worry about the ground moving.
So can we agree he can't tell if the ground's moving?
Well, he would be able to tell if the ground's moving, yes, because if he was going north or south and it was rotating eastward, he would see it going left or right underneath him. He would see a rotation going underneath him, right or left or right, depending on if he's going north or south. He would definitely notice that.
Okay, so let's go back to our drone in the aeroplane. Can the drone tell?
You agree he would notice that, right?
Can the drone tell how fast the aeroplane's moving?
Why are you trying to go back to inside of a one reference frame inside of a closed capsule? Because why are you trying to run away from the fact that he would definitely know if the ground was moving faster underneath him when he's trying to land?
Because we need to establish a fact that he cannot know how fast the ground is moving compared to an external observer. All he can know is how fast he is moving relative to the ground.
Relative to a stationary ground. That's how they measure it. It's not relative to a moving ground. It would be a completely different thing.
All he knows is how fast he's going relative to the ground and how fast.
Relative to a stationary ground, that's all he needs to know. If it was a moving ground, he would need to know that.
No, he doesn't, because you cannot tell, right?
He can't tell that the ground's moving twice as fast as where he took off from? How is that possible? What's the mechanism that makes the plane so in sync that he can't even tell that it's moving?
Listen, we're not talking about the transition at the minute. We're talking about at either end. You cannot tell whether you're doing 500 miles an hour or 1,000 miles an hour. All you can tell is how fast you're going compared to the ground. There are no other
clues. To a stationary ground. If it was a moving ground, it would be. You would totally be able to tell. What are you talking about?
Wait. You cannot tell, right? You cannot
I'm not going to agree that he couldn't tell. The ground is stationary. As far as he can tell, the ground is stationary. I'll give you that. But the only reason that it would seem stationary is if it's actually stationary. Because if it's moving at a different rate than where he took off from, that would be noticeable, and he would have to account for it. It'd have to be a mechanism that makes him perfectly in sync, which you don't have.
So it's a fundamental tenet in physics, in classical physics, is that you cannot tell your absolute velocity, right? You can think that you're traveling at constant velocity x. Somebody else that's traveling at x plus 10 thinks you're only doing 10, right? If you only got those two references. And the pilot's the same. All he can tell is how fast he is compared to the ground. He's got no idea how fast he is traveling through space.
Why are you? It seems like you're tactically avoiding the problem here.
No,
it seems like you might know it's actually stationary because you're being so tactical in the way that you're trying to re-describe this in a way that somehow. Are you just trying to convince yourself, or nobody's listening is thinking that you're making any sense? The plane has to be moving eastward.
No, he's making perfect sense. Yeah, he's making.
Okay, then please explain it. Maybe you could do better.
Hold on, I have a quick question for both of you. If instead of a pilot flying an airplane like that, if you were in a boxcar on a train, maybe moving, maybe not, and you were throwing paper airplanes to each other, would it make any difference if the train was moving? Not.
Well, if you were moving at 1,000 miles an hour and I was moving at 500 miles an hour, that would be something that I'd have to make my paper airplane account for when I'm throwing it to you. That's the point.
Hold on.
There's no point. Like Rollin, my Boulder.
Just want to know.
The tactic of trying to make it one reference frame when it's actually two with a tangential gradient is not being displayed by anybody throwing anything on any airplane or inside any kind of train. Maybe that's good enough for you to think it might work, but you're not accounting for the tangential gradient. It'd be as if you had a train going by you and you were trying to throw a paper airplane to your friend on the other train that's moving faster or slower than you are. That would be the difference.
Because the ball rotates, the ground rotates at different rates.
It's going faster at the equator, right? That's not accounted for inside your paper airplane.
I agree with you. I didn't account for that. Do you
agree that would have to be accounted for.
Train,
you agree?
Yeah, well, I think so.
Okay, so how's that accounted for? Let's just get to that.
I want to make sure
on a single train, yes, inside one reference frame, we can act like we're not moving, but that doesn't make any difference because we're talking about a difference of landing where the ground is now literally said to be moving twice as fast, and the pilot doesn't take into account. He just treats it as stationary. The ground speed is its motion forward wherever he goes compared to a stationary ground. If it were a moving ground with a tangential gradient, those readings would not be the same. So therefore, we're not on a globe, bro.
There was a lot of jumps there that I don't necessarily agree with, but
okay. Well, how's the plane in perfect sync when it lands at 1,000 miles an hour? What's the mechanism that makes it move backwards when it's facing west and slowing down to keep the plane moving perfectly in sync at 1,000 miles an hour backwards as it's slowing down? What's the mechanism that does that?
There's two things that you have to consider when you think about it. One is wind, what it's doing, and the other are the plane's engines and what they're doing. The plane isn't a ballistic object.
You could take all that into account. Are you trying to say that the wind
its momentum?
Yeah, it can go forward and back. It can do whatever it wants, right? And all of those motions are relative to what they say. what he treats as stationary. The pilot always treats it as if it's stationary. He doesn't have to do anything with his engines to try to keep up with the spin of the Earth. Agreed?
No, I don't necessarily agree with that at all.
Oh, are you saying that the pilot actually does something to make sure he's going eastward fast enough to be in sync with the Earth?
I'm saying that he has engines, and so he can change his momentum, and we have to factor that into any thoughts that we have.
Okay, well, I'm just saying, are you saying that's part of the reason that he stays in sync is he uses his engines to make sure the plane's moving eastward faster?
Certainly, he can change his momentum with his engines.
Yeah, but are you trying to claim that the pilot tries to stay in sync with the faster moving Earth that's got a tangential grading? Are you saying is that your claim?
That he's speeding
no,
up
I'm not.
and slowing
I'm not
down.
making any such claim. I'm telling you that.
Well, why are you trying to say keep in mind that engines and winds are a thing? Okay, so like we got engines that. Okay, let's just. I'm not. There's nothing to factor in. He treats the Earth as stationary.
I don't think you can
have to worry about
ballistic. I don't think you can treat.
No, I'm not treating. I threw Coriolis out at the beginning of this conversation. Coriolis is only if it's a ballistic. You're right?
May
so Coriolis has nothing to do with it.
Just let Mathew go.
Yes.
He was going to either
New perspective.
All right, Mathew, my old friend.
No,
we've been through this for hours, years ago.
Oh my gosh. Okay.
Go ahead, Mathew.
I was just going to suggest new perspective that you listen to 2 sentences in a row when Rollin the Boulder is speaking. That's all I was going to pipe in.
Yeah, his 2 sentences was you have to factor in wind and engines as if that made a difference. Well, if it's the engines, then the pilot's actually trying to keep up with the Earth. If it's the wind, then we have wind going in one direction, carrying the plane backwards, but we know wind's going all directions. And wind being there, and the only time they say that the air is actually in sync with the Earth is when there's no wind. So you'd have to imagine that there's this somehow this air that's like perfectly still is making the plane accelerate backwards in sync with the Earth twice as fast as where he took off from. That doesn't work. So it's not the engines or the wind.
I think it's the wind, and it's gradual over the course of several hours.
Hidden in the winds?
The wind that goes only in one direction, wind's going all directions.
Right, but it's the cumulative effect of the wind, like the average.
Yeah, but you don't land on a surface because you're more or less thought to be in the air that's kind of almost in sync. You can't kind of almost land as if it's stationary. It has to be perfectly stationary. And there's no wind, even if it worked perfectly, as you like somehow the air is carrying him backwards, even though one day there was heavy westward winds. And the air compensated more so because of the heavy westward winds one day. And then there's northern winds another day. And somehow it compensated for that perfectly because we think of it as more or less in sync. That just makes no sense. You're saying it has like some kind of consciousness that it overrides winds depending on the day?
Pilots can navigate even if there's wind in different directions, yes.
Well, you may not have been here for the beginning of this, Matthew, because I've changed my scenario to make sure that it's very clear he has no path to adjust for. He's not compensating for anything. He's just a joyriding pilot. He's doing big loops all over the Earth. He's going to land in a clearing somewhere whenever he feels like it. There's no destination, nothing to correct for. But he'll always be able to treat it as stationary, even if it's thought to be moving twice as fast.
That's correct.
Matthew was saying that it was the
doesn't work.
He was saying it was the average of all the winds. So Matthew, you're saying that like a 10-mile-an-hour wind out of the east, 20 miles out of the west, all that somehow averages out to also account for the 1,000-mile-an-hour speed of the Earth, like in contrast, like it somehow averages to float you along with the rotation, all kind of basically compelling you to just treat it as stationary?
I was saying that on average, the air above the point that's going 500 miles an hour is going about the same speed. And same thing over the equator. The air above the equator is on average going about 1,039 miles per hour, like the ground. So basically, the air above the ground is going about the same speed as the ground beneath it. Now, obviously, there's, any moment in time, there might be a little bit of wind one direction or the other. But those things kind of cumulatively add up as you go from north to south, so that you have a stronger eastward movement as you fly south.
Let's say I had a nephew that was going to be a pilot, right? And he's been talking to me, and I'm telling them, like, if it's a globe, this is what they say, that, even if you got heavy winds one day, it's moving you a lot, don't worry. The cumulative average is going to make your plane somehow in sync, so it'll always look stationary to you, no matter what. Do you realize how ridiculous that? I mean, what if he's scared? How would you explain to him that it just works out perfectly, even though you've got all these different variables that could be different one
Just
day to
because it
one day
sounds
to the next?
ridiculous to you doesn't make it false.
It's not about it sounding ridiculous to me. It is
You just
literally
said it.
objectively ridiculous. Literally and objectively, that is ridiculous to think
Okay.
heavy westward winds one day wouldn't make a difference, because we can cumulatively think about it kinematically somehow being enough that we can call it perfect.
Yeah, Matthew, are you saying the average winds are 1,000, and then south of the equator they're 990, 980, 970, and the average is like perfectly gradiated? The average is a perfect gradient for
No,
each
I'm saying
latitude?
that at any point on Earth, the air above the ground goes about the same speed as the ground beneath it. Now, obviously, there are prevailing winds, but generally, the air above a certain point goes about the same speed as that point below it.
How would you know
I'm
that?
not saying anything.
That's just what it's thought to be, right?
Right. That's
Don't they say that the actual wind patterns, like the difference between the atmosphere's rotation and the Earth's surface rotation, is what causes the different weather patterns or affects those weather patterns?
Yeah, you're talking about the cause of weather. I'm talking about just the effect. The effect is on both models that the air above a particular point on the ground goes about the same speed as the ground below you. You say it's zero, but I say
yeah, but about the same speed is not even good enough, Matthew. Like, you don't want to be about the same. To land as if it's stationary, it has to be perfect, not just an average. Think of it as like a cumulative. It has to be perfect, so much so that the pilot can just treat it as perfectly stationary. It can't be almost stationary. It has to be perfectly stationary.
This is what I was talking about 2 sentences in a row. All right, you guys have a good evening. Good.
I know you don't have any answers, Matthew. Otherwise, you would stick around.
It doesn't have to be perfectly stationary. Pilots land on aircraft carriers that are underway. They can land on.
Yeah, so you're trying to say now that the Earth is an aircraft carrier?
You said that they have to land on something perfectly stationary, and I give you a counter.
Right, and I'm saying that they have special training for pilots that land on air. They have special training for aircraft pilots that land on aircraft carriers. They have to treat the runway when it drifts. They have to have special training. You don't do special training for people to land on Earth because it might be slightly moving.
Sure you do. There is definitely special training for people that want to land an airplane on Earth. It's called
special training compared to an aircraft pilot, because the runway would be moving for them. That's why they have special training.
No, they have special training for many reasons.
Well, that as well as other reasons. But that's so my point is made.
But a pilot that wants to land on concrete runways also has to take training, right? You can't just, that's not something you just do.
Yeah, but he's never taught, like an aircraft pilot, that the runway you're landing on might be drifting slightly to one direction or another. That's not the regular pilot's training.
Well, that's not true, because crosswinds can definitely push the airplane around side to side.
Totally different things. If it was crosswinds as well as a drifting runway, that'd be two things to deal with. Rollin, my Boulder.
Okay. But
two things.
Landing in crosswinds and landing on a moving runway are very similar problems.
You can look at it as very similar, totally different at the same time, because if the runway were drifting and he's got a crosswind in a totally other miscellaneous way, then he'd have to account for the runway drifting as well as the winds. Two different things.
Okay, but you said pilots, it has to be all perfectly stationary, and that's not true. They can deal with moving runways, and they can deal with crosswinds. So
wait, hold on. A pilot deals with a regular pilot deals. No, a regular pilot's never taught to deal with a moving runway ever.
He's taught to deal with crosswinds, and crosswinds
totally different, which I just explained.
Not totally different.
Well, they are different. It would be two things to deal with, which I just explained. If he's got a drifting runway that's going eastward at a different rate than his plane is, which never happens, right? And then he's got another a westward wind or a west southwest wind. That'd be two things to deal with. If he had to deal with a moving runway and winds going in a totally different direction, that would be what an aircraft pilot has to deal with and get special training for.
So you agree that pilots can certainly overcome all of these problems with their engines, right?
No, because the runway moving would be a problem he never deals with because it wouldn't be stationary relative to his eastward movement any longer.
But pilots can overcome all these problems with their engines, right?
No, they wouldn't. If the Earth were moving, they would have to be trained. They would have to be trained, and it would have to somehow be able to move the plane backwards. What if he's facing westward, Rollin? If he's facing west, southwest at an angle, right? How would he move the plane backwards and sideways to stay in sync with a rotating Earth and go forward to slow down to a land? The plane's not made to do that. He's not trained to do that. Nope. He would have to have the plane literally going backwards and sideways, which it's not made to do. He's not trained to make it do.
Backwards and sideways.
Because you don't understand the whole concept, right? If he took off with a conserved momentum, it's not a straw man. The globe model says there's a tangential gradient, right? Moving fastest at the equator. That means that the plane, if it took off anywhere else, it has to be moving faster eastward. Even if it's facing the opposite direction, the plane has to continue moving in perfect sync eastward, backwards or sideways or whatever. And it would have to be if the Earth were moving.
You can land on an aircraft carrier. It doesn't have to be perfect sync.
Now you're comparing it to an aircraft carrier again as if the pilot's trained to land on a moving surface, which he isn't.
Because they can land in difficult winds.
Why are you trying to compare it to winds again when we just explained there's two different scenarios? Winds moving the plane, trying to land on a stationary runway, and winds moving the plane, trying to land on a moving runway. That's the difference. Don't just keep going back to that as if I didn't explain why there's a difference and you didn't also agree.
I will keep going back. Every time you say perfect sync, I'm going to say that winds and aircraft carriers make it so you don't have to be in perfect sync. The plane has engines and it can overcome those problems.
But we also, I can go back and just say it again. Everyone else is going to be like, dude, you already explained that aircraft pilots have to have special training because the actual runway might be moving and there could be winds as well. That's not how regular pilots are trained. They're not trained to deal with a moving runway. To say aircraft pilots are somehow regular pilots is just making you sound more dumb every time you repeat it.
Just a counterexample, and it's a good one.
It doesn't. It's not a good one. They do not treat the Earth as if it's moving. No regular pilot has to account for a moving runway. Aircraft pilots do. To say it's a good one is just like now you're saying my stupid comparison is still great.
I want to hear the argument from a Boulder. How do they separate and distinguish the difference between the atmosphere in lockstep with the Earth and the winds? How do you distinguish the difference between the atmosphere and the winds?
And they don't even try to claim lockstep anymore. They used to say lockstep a long time ago, but they have to admit that fluid dynamics, they wouldn't be in lockstep even if it were moving. There's no slip. Yes.
The simple answer there is that it's not in pure lockstep. It almost is. The Earth in general is moving with the Earth. The wind velocity is the difference between that ideal fixed air and the motion of the Earth. That's what wind is. Wind is relative velocity between the ground and the air.
Yeah, like substantially, like chemically, like particularly, like any way that you want to do it scientifically. How do you measure and distinguish the difference between atmosphere and wind, like the composition?
The bulk of the air rotates with the Earth, and you can see that in weather patterns, that the weather patterns don't move very fast. Now, they're not moving at 1,000 miles an hour across the surface of the Earth. and so the atmosphere, which is that all of the gases around the Earth, more or less move with the Earth. They're stirred up by the sun and by the rotation, and that's what wind is.
But Dazza, you do believe that truth prevails.
Don't you love this getting to explain wind? I mean, it's kind of wild.
More or less. I mean, that's ridiculous. More or less, we could just think of it as perfectly in sync, because we say more or less or overall, some kind of average. None of that is at all good enough, dude.
So we can say that the Earth and the atmosphere around it are perfectly in sync, plus or minus wind.
So now it is in sync. There's so many times that
plus or minus wind, Geo. Right?
Oh, so I know, but
wind, so wind is the slip between the Earth and the potentially perfectly rotating atmosphere.
Okay.
Yeah. So the slip, right? There's no slip zone. Even if it were rotating, there's no way at an altitude very far up it would be anywhere near in physically. The actual physics of it, if actually we're moving, to claim that it would be like this block of air that indefinitely goes up and just continues on with the perfect rotation. I mean, that's just ridiculous on any kind of common sense level, as well as physics and any kind of. They don't even claim that. The no slip zone would be very, very.
If there's a gradient from the equator going north or south, let's say there's no wind, it's just completely still. You would probably say the wind at the equator is going 1,000, and the wind south of the equator is going 999, 998. So what if it's all just very still? There's no wind. What is causing that gradient to go at all different speeds as you travel south?
So, in that scenario, if it was perfectly still, the only thing that could be causing it would be essentially the friction between the ground and the Earth, dragging everything along together. And you can see this in, you've probably heard of Newton's bucket experiment, where you get a bucket of water and spin it round, that the water forms a parabolic shape on surface, but compared to any point in the bucket, the water is stationary. So the water is moving in sync with the bucket, but if you were to measure the velocity of that water from the outside, where you can see the bucket spinning, you get that gradient of velocity, of angular velocity. Actually, the angular velocity is constant, but the rotational velocity increases towards the edges, the tangential velocity rather. So you can have something rotating, everything in lockstep, but still have that that velocity gradient from the perspective of somebody watching the rotation.
Can you demonstrate that? Like, have you been able to make a model or seen a model that in a lab, or just like a reproduction of that?
So the rotating bucket model you can reproduce to show that fluids can.
I'm talking about a wet water ball in a vacuum.
Oh, no, you don't need.
It's funny that in a lab. You mentioned in a lab we have a lab frame, right? There's an absolute lab frame, right?
No, there's not an absolute lab frame.
There would be.
As far as we know, there's no absolute reference frame.
Well,
this is what I call relative retardation. Just because you can think of it as relative doesn't make everything relative. I mean, the stationary ground is the lab.
You can demonstrate the ground is rotating. There's a whole bunch. Anything that's got really strong inertial.
Oh, really? What's the demonstration? Hold on. You can prove the Earth is rotating. How is that?
Yes, you can.
So inertial navigation systems, right? Yeah.
Are we going to go with this?
I feel a GPS coming on. I feel a GPS is in our future.
We're going to go GPS, or we're going to go with the three-ring laser gyro. Pendulum. We're going to do all these things that associate with the idea that we're rotating, even though there's definitely other possible explanations that aren't being considered.
We might even get the pictures in space. We might even get the pictures in space.
Buddy, you can get a measurements of Earth rotating through a mechanical gyroscope.
Yeah, we've been through. I know you're kind of new to this argument. We've a lot. 15 degrees could be ether wind.
They already did that with the ring laser.
And at altitude,
They tried to
does it change at altitude? No, it changes at altitude, doesn't it?
You mean, does it change at altitude?
Yeah, if you went up higher. But regardless, let's just get back to the planes thing with the atmosphere. You wouldn't have a block of atmosphere, like the idea that there'd have a still wind block of air going indefinitely up higher and somehow staying in lockstep when there's not even claimed to be in lockstep, but then you have to pretend it's in lockstep so you can think of the air moving the plane that, more or less going to help, even though heavy winds one day, heavy winds in the opposite direction, all of that's going to average out to somehow make the pilot always just treat the Earth as stationary, even though there's a tangential gradient. I think everyone listening, being an objective about this, has been able to hear how ridiculous that idea really is.
So you need to make some idealizations, right, to understand what's going on. So first of all, you make an idealization and you have a think about what could be happening, and then you compare it to what you see in reality.
Yeah, in reality, the pilot treats it as perfectly stationary, and there's nothing to make the plane.
Nobody is denying that. You keep.
I'm not saying that. We're in agreement, right? He treats it as perfectly stationary, so there would have to be something to make the plane perfectly in sync for him to treat it as perfectly stationary.
That's his engines, right? He flies along and he maintains a ground speed, so he's never getting out of sync.
What do you mean? Now you're going back to engines? Okay, so you're an engines guy rather than an air guy.
He's got powered flight. He's keeping up. He's maintaining a particular ground speed. So it doesn't matter what is happening to the ground underneath. At his ground speed, and we're talking speed compared to the ground here, right? Not his absolute.
To the stationary ground. Yeah, his ground speed is the plane's movement forward, maybe only 100 miles an hour. And he's going the opposite direction of the spin. So that has nothing to do with him speeding the plane up eastward when he's going west-southwest against the spin at only 100 miles an hour. And now the plane's got to be moving eastward twice as fast, 500 miles per hour faster than where he took off from. There's no mechanism in the plane that's making the plane do that. There's no air that's making the plane do that. There's nothing to do that for the plane to treat the Earth as stationary when it's moving twice as fast as where he took off from.
Yeah, Pat, Dazza, if you go from the North Pole where there's zero, air mass speed, then all the way to the equator when it's 1,000, how has that 1,000 impacted your airplane to where you wouldn't have to change anything of your actual flight characteristics?
Okay. So there's a fundamental idea in physics, Geo, that if you're traveling along at a constant velocity and think you're traveling at a constant velocity, you can't be aware of what your true absolute velocity is. That all you can know is that you're traveling relative to some other thing at a certain speed, at a constant velocity. So flying around at the North Pole, all you can know is that you've got a certain speed compared to the ground. That's your only reference. If it was rotating really fast and you had an acceleration because of the rotation, a high acceleration, you'd know because acceleration is detectable. But linear velocities, which is what we're dealing with here, right? Linear velocities effectively because the thing's so big that we've been talking about potentially. So you're traveling at the North Pole. Someone on the outside that can see the Earth rotating can see that you've got a relatively small rotation, small velocity compared to their inertial view. You get to the equator, that external observer that can see the equator rotating sees you now have a higher velocity, but from your perspective, you can't tell because your velocity compared to the ground is the only reference you have. You cannot tell that you're traveling any faster than you were at the pole.
Yeah, so what makes the plane perfect? This gradient just perfectly cancels out the Earth rotation, essentially.
No, the gradient is there. If you could measure it, there would be from the outside, there would be a velocity gradient. So if you're watching the Earth rotate and you put a little probe in to measure the wind going past the probe, it would increase as you went down. But
the globe model claims that it's internal. The globe model claims it's literally 1,000 miles per hour compared to 0. It doesn't have anything to do with an outside observer. The globe model claims that it would be literally moving 1,000 miles an hour faster at the equator. It doesn't have anything to do with perspective or any of that. Who cares about that? The plane would have to be moving eastward 1,000 miles an hour faster than where it took off.
So can I just finish my thing, Theo?
He's just saying when you're on the Earth, you wouldn't notice it, but if you were out in space, basically, and you were looking at it, it would be moving a lot faster.
I know what he's saying, but it doesn't make any more sense because he's saying it.
So can I go back to the bucket again? So in that rotating bucket, right? If you had a large, imagine you get a paddling pool and you can spin it around, speed meter in the water. On the outside, you would measure a higher speed than you would on the inside. But for somebody that's in the water, they see no speed difference between the water because all they can see around them is stationary water. And the atmosphere is much like that.
That doesn't help you at all, Dazza. None of this helps you. The plane would have to be moving eastward. There's no mechanism to make the plane go faster eastward as it's going against the spin at 100, 200 miles an hour the whole time and not even having the direction. You have no mechanism. Talking about different perspectives doesn't help you.
I mean, would Mathew or Dazza or one of you guys that were been talking about this, Mathew, I see your back, but would you agree that like God would have had to program in a perfectly moving gradient that goes along with the latitude lines, in which like if you were 5 feet north or 5 feet to the south, or 10 feet, or a mile or 10 miles, that every little increment of the Earth, every foot of the Earth, would have a slightly different air mass speed?
Yes, if there were no wind. However, there's wind, and so it could be plus or minus 30 miles an hour in any direction, and planes could still take off and land because they can handle crosswinds, no problem.
Well, yeah, but because crosswinds could be heavier one day, Mathew, and lighter another day. So how is the air mass accounting for those differences?
What do you mean? The air sort of moves around in weather.
Yeah, you got variables like heavier one day, right? But then you're saying that the average is going to still make the plane perfectly in sync?
I just meant that the air above a certain point on Earth is about the same speed as the one below it. Not always, but there is wind.
Yeah, but being just a little bit off would make a big difference when the plane's trying to land. It's not going to make the plane perfectly in sync.
Yeah, if it's 5 miles an hour off, it's not a big deal. Maybe 20 miles an hour off. Planes
20 miles an hour. So you're saying if the runway's moving 20 miles an hour eastward differently than the plane, that wouldn't make a difference. It would be in a perpendicular direction that it's trying to land.
Right.
You realize that doesn't work, right? Even 5 miles an hour would make a big difference. No, crosswinds are totally different. You could have winds going the opposite direction and an eastward moving runway. That'd be two things to deal with, not one.
I lost my place. I'm sorry.
Yeah, if the runway was moving and he had winds in a different direction than the runway moving, that'd be two things to deal with.
All right, yeah,
not just one. Crosswind and a moving runway would be two things. Yes or no?
Yes, it would be two things if the runway were moving.
Okay, yeah. So that's what we don't have to deal with. He deals with crosswinds. He doesn't deal with a moving runway.
Yeah, I don't know what to tell you. I mean, it works in my mind, and I think it's reasonable, but I can't explain it to you in a way that makes sense, apparently.
No, it's not about explaining it to me. You have no answer to what I just said. He never deals with a moving runway, but he would have to if it was.
I do have an answer. It makes sense in my mind, and it works perfectly, and many, many people agree with me. It's not an appeal to...
it's not about explaining it to me. Just say what makes sense to you. How does it make sense in your mind that the runway could be moving twice as fast as the airport he took off from, and we have all these different variable winds, but then somehow he can always just treat it as perfectly stationary and never deal with a moving runway?
Because the change is gradual.
Right, and he's got no ground path, right? He's got no ground path. He's just a joyriding pilot. He's going to land in a clearing, so there's nothing to correct for. The change being gradual has nothing to do with it. We've still got all those variables, still moving twice as fast. He's still treated as stationary. How is that even possible in your mind?
Same way that if you walk from the center of a carousel out to the edge slowly, you won't really notice the difference.
So you think of it as one reference frame, even though it's two. Is that how you get away with it? Because that's one reference frame if you're on the ground. That's where the conserved momentum came from. It doesn't come from being in the air, Mathew.
Yeah, the reference frame changes gradually enough that you won't notice. That's what I'm saying. It's way
That
less.
sounds like you're just coping. You're just coping and imagining it works when you know literally every single ounce of logic in your brain has to tell you that it's not going to work out perfect.
It works out perfectly and logically, and I understand how it works. So
What?
That's incorrect.
What's the mechanism to make the plane go faster eastward?
As it's flying, let's say you start at the North Pole and fly south to the equator, and you just go straight south. As you go south, you slowly pick up an eastward vector based on the wind and the air, because the air is moving slightly more and more fast towards the east. And that slight vector is way, way, way less than the airspeed and the wind, so you won't notice it, and they don't have to really worry about it.
Well, they don't have to worry about it, but the plane's moving 1,000 miles an hour eastward faster than where it took off from. But he doesn't even notice
it.
To the ground.
That's right.
That makes no sense that he wouldn't notice it. But then,
I just explained how it made sense to me. You asked how it made sense to me, and I answered your question. Now
okay, it sounds like you don't want to defend what you thought made sense to you.
It makes sense to me. I explained.
Well, it sounds like you have to keep that idea in your head and just cling to it, even though it really doesn't make sense.
No, that would be projecting. I think you're projecting some of your ideas from
No,
the flat
I'm
earth.
saying it literally wouldn't work. It's not about what makes sense to somebody. We're talking about winds going all different directions at variable speeds, one day to the next, 1 hour to the next, and somehow you're saying the average of that is going to make the plane perfectly in sync.
Bingo! There you go.
That makes no sense to anybody having any kind of logical reasoning.
It makes no sense to you.
It's not about me. It's about anybody that can see objectively wouldn't have an average wind speed be perfect. It's just an average. That's why they call it an average. It's not predictable. You could have one day that there's just heavy, heavy westward winds the whole time. The whole time he's flying there, heavy westward winds. And the next day there's no westward winds. But somehow you're saying the average is the same and it's going to make it perfectly in sync. That's just wishful thinking.
Pilots adjust for wind speed. In fact, they fly.
Yeah,
they don't.
They adjust for wind speed. They don't adjust for a moving ground.
Yeah, they don't have to, because the wind speed takes.
That's why it'd be two things, which you agreed to. It'd be two things, not one. Wind speed's one thing, moving ground's another.
New perspective, can you explain to me your understanding of relative velocity and what it means?
As if that's going to help you.
No, well, it might help you. If you can explain to me what relative velocity is and what the implications are.
You want to go back to the ground speed of the relative velocity of the plane compared to the stationary Earth, which is how they get their relative velocity? If it was a moving Earth, it'd be a totally different relative. It'd be relative to a moving Earth rather than a stationary Earth. Do we have to go through this again, Dazza?
Okay, yeah. So good. You just nailed it there, that their velocity can be relative to a moving Earth or a stationary Earth, and they don't know the difference is the key point there.
They would if it was moving, because they only know that their relative velocity is in relation to a stationary Earth. If it was a moving Earth with a tangential gradient, they would know the difference, definitely.
Just ignoring the gradient for a minute and just looking at the actual
Let's just ignore the only point I'm making. Let's ignore your point and then just talk about something else for a while, and somehow it'll make like total sense to anybody that's listening.
So if we ignore your point for a minute, just to get a clear understanding of what relative velocity is, okay?
Why don't you explain what you're trying to say?
Okay, so if you have a velocity relative to something else, you can typically measure it, right? So you'll be able to see the ground, you'll be able to see whatever it is that you're measuring your velocity relative to. If you have no reference to anything else, you cannot tell what your velocity is. And the best example of that is to be in an airliner at 10 kilometers above the air on smooth skies. You cannot tell that you're moving. There are zero indications that you're in motion. And everything behaves just as though you are stationary on the ground, right? This is what relative velocity is all about.
Doesn't have anything to do with the problem that you're avoiding.
It does, because the pilot is only aware of his velocity relative to the ground and relative
stationary
to the
ground.
He has no idea about his velocity in terms of anything else, because there is nothing about his external velocity that would alter what he feels or sees.
How would the ground speed change if the ground were moving faster where he's landing?
So his ground speed doesn't change. So this is his relative ground speed doesn't change. His speed relative.
No, it would. I'm talking about how would the relative ground speed change if the Earth were actually moving?
So he is deliberately maintaining a constant relative ground speed, right? He's
right, but when you say that, that's they do measure the relative speed of the plane compared to a stationary surface. Yes or no, Dazza?
They measure it compared to the surface. That's the only
is that surface have. Is that surface with a tangential gradient accounted for within the measurements of what they call ground speed, which is the relative speed of the plane to the ground? No, it's not. It's just a stationary ground. Proven right there. My point is proven.
I just described before that the velocity of the aircraft relative to the ground is completely independent of what the ground's doing relative to something else.
Well, no, the ground moving faster than where it took off from would be a completely different reading.
Okay, so if the ground is moving and you're measuring the speed relative to somebody that can detect the ground moving, you're not measuring your ground speed. You're measuring your speed relative to that other person.
I don't know why you're getting another person involved. I'm talking about the ground that's moving either faster than where he took off from or stationary, just like where he took off from. If it was moving faster than where he took off from, that ground speed would be a totally different number. It would be incalculable. Even if you if you trained a pilot somehow to know this, or just told him, and there'd be no way to account for it. Even if all of that was out in the open and saying, okay, the ground's be moving faster, you're going to have to be moving eastward faster. I'm sorry, this is what you're going to have to deal with. There would be no way to even make the plane go eastward faster when he's going the opposite direction. You can't make the plane go backwards and forwards at the same time. It's that simple.
Okay, so here's a scenario that might help you understand relative velocity.
It's not about me not understanding it. Don't even frame it as helping me understand it. You have to account for the tangential gradient. It has nothing to do with me understanding it. It only has to do with you admitting that the ground speed is relative to a stationary ground. You're done right there, dude. You're done. You're done.
Okay.
If it was a moving ground, there would be a totally different reading. It would be relative to a moving ground, not relative to a stationary ground.
So let's say we're back in our aircraft.
Oh my God.
We've got an Airbus A380. And there's no seats. We've got a drone, and we're flying the drone up and down the aircraft. What is my ground speed? How would I measure my ground speed?
Are we going back to an enclosed container without a tangential gradient? We're going back to where we started from, as if that wasn't already totally thrown out the window. One reference frame compared to two. No tangential gradient compared to a tangential gradient. I mean, why compare things that aren't what we're talking about? Oranges, apples, we went through this.
I'm about to introduce your gradient, right? So you're in the plane, it's parked on the runway, you're flying a drone up and down. You're measuring the speed relative to the deck of the aircraft, right? That is your ground speed. So the plane taxis out and takes off and is at cruising speed, and you're flying a drone up and down the plane. You're still measuring the same ground speed compared to the deck of the aircraft, right? You're still flying up and down at 20 meters a second or whatever your drone can do. But you've got 1,000 miles an hour on top of that the aircraft is given relative to the ground. But your drone's flying up and down. It thinks its speed is only 20 meters a second up and down the aircraft, right? That is what relative speed is all about. all it can do is measure its speed to some other reference, and the only reference the pilot has is the ground. If the ground is moving relative to somebody else, he does not know. And relative to that somebody else, the pilot only has to pick up 1 mile an hour every minute relative to somebody else to maintain his relative velocity across the ground. And an aircraft can put on 200 kilometers an hour in 20 seconds, right? When it takes off.
Dazza, why don't you just explain it? Like, keep the scenario that I'm talking about. Explain how it would actually work with actual mechanics and actual mechanisms and actual things that would actually happen. You have to just dance around it with all these, like, well, think about it as like this. And if your side this, and what about the plane that would be taking off and now it's going faster, but he doesn't know it? And if there's an outside perspective, just explain. Not that I think you have an answer. It's unfair for me to ask this, but what makes the plane go faster backwards as it's landing in the opposite direction?
Okay, so the plane is only going backwards from the perspective of somebody watching it from the outside.
No, it would have to be literally doing it. It has nothing to do with any kind of perspective. An outside viewer has nothing to do with that. The globe says it's 1,000 miles an hour. It says it's zero at the poles. It says there's a tangential gradient. That means literally. It has nothing to do with anyone looking at it.
If the globe says that the Earth is rotating relative to an inertial observer, and that rotation results in a tangential velocity from the perspective of that inertial observer. That is the only person who sees that velocity is somebody on the outside.
Didn't I just say that it's ridiculous to even frame it as someone looking at it? Dude, it's literally what they say. It has nothing to do with the perspective or somebody seeing it from this. I mean, why are you saying it's relative to that? It would literally be moving 1,000 miles an hour faster than where it was at the pole. That's just one thing to deal with. Don't worry about anyone's perspective or any kind of outside observer. It would have to be moving eastward, even if it's having to go backwards when it gets there. And there's no mechanism to make that happen. I mean, I don't know. I mean, you can just keep re-explaining it. It's like you're trying to convince yourself instead of anyone else.
So if you're sitting on a merry-go-round and you're on the outside and you're looking towards the center, what is the velocity of the center of the merry-go-round compared to you on the outside?
Now we're going to merry-go-rounds, Dazza. I said just keep it to the scenario I'm talking about. Why you have to go out to? Do you understand? I mean, this is crazy.
Because you don't understand.
It sounds like you're having a mental breakdown. Let's just talk about a merry-go-round that you're sitting on, and talk about whatever. Relatively looking at it, dude, the plane would have to be literally moving 1,000 miles an hour eastward faster. Do you agree to that?
I am saying that eastward velocity.
Wait, do you agree to that? Yes or no?
Let me finish.
Do you agree that the plane would have to be moving eastward to land as if it's stationary at the same exact rate as the ground? Yes or no?
From the perspective of somebody that sees the Earth rotating, yes.
What? I'm not talking about a perspective of someone looking at it. I'm talking about literally would the plane have to be moving at the same exact rate as the ground for the pilot to be stationary?
Doesn't appear to have any velocity.
Has nothing to do with the way the ground appears. Talking about the globe model claims it's 1,000 miles an hour tangential velocity at the equator. The globe model also claims that it's a tangential gradient to be zero at the poles. So do you agree that the pilot would be having to land on a stationary surface? That means his plane would be moving exactly the same rate as the ground for him to be able to do that? Yes or no? Would the plane have to be moving eastward at the exact same speed for the pilot to treat it as stationary? Yes or no? Why can't you answer this? It sounds retarded that you can't even answer a direct question. I mean, not that I think that. I mean, it's obvious to everybody else that that's what would have to happen. So it's just weird that you won't admit that that's what would have to happen. But then you're coming up with ways of making that happen, and then saying, "Oh, well, it doesn't really have to happen."
Don't you think it's hypocritical that you are getting stuck into me for not answering your question, but you wouldn't answer the simple one about the merry-go-round?
I'm not talking about merry-go-rounds. We're talking about a plane not being in sync with the Earth when it lands.
We're on
it has nothing to do with me refusing. I'm ignoring your merry-go-rounds and you're inside the capsule of a plane. Why not just talk about what I'm saying?
I'll go with your merry-go-round for a second, though. Let me just say, if you're at the center of the merry-go-round and it's going really fast, and you're hardly moving, you're at the center of it. If you were to like quickly walk from the center out to the outside, you might slip off your feet because the ground would be moving so fast. You know, if you just went quickly, that it would. Okay. You know, and if you.
That's not the scenario, right? The scenario is the merry-go-round is rotating quite slowly. You're moving across it slowly. But we can even go back one further and just consider the situation where you're not moving. You're sitting on the merry-go-round and it's rotating. It's not rotating fast enough that you can feel it spinning. You can't see anything spinning around you. All you can see is the merry-go-round. If you look to the center of the merry-go-round or any other point on that merry-go-round, it appears to be stationary compared to you, right? And that's the scenario of the Earth, that from any point on the Earth, every other point appears to be stationary, right? That's our baseline for measuring all of our velocities.
So it's about what it appears to be, not what it really is?
No, not only does it appear to be stationary relative to you, that every point on Earth is literally stationary relative to you. There's no change in its position relative to you.
Oh, so we're in perfect agreement. It's literally stationary. That's what I've been trying to say this whole time. It's literally stationary. That's how the pilot's literally able to treat it as stationary when he lands. That's the only way the pilot could treat it as stationary is if it's literally stationary. I'm glad we finally agree.
Booked a flight today, Heathrow to JFK. Headed west-southwest, cause there ain't no better way. Gonna find that old Coriolis, they say she's hidden in the winds. But that just can't be if we rotate east, tangential gradient. Hidden in the winds, Coriolis must be hidden in the winds. But the Earth ain't moving faster with the further south we've been. And we never could land safely with that tangential gradient. And we all know every pilot treats the Earth as motionless. So to think it must be moving is just insane, you must confess. But please don't get offended if this song makes too much sense. Just thank God that landing's easy with no tangential gradient in the winds. They said she'd just be hidden in the winds. But the Earth ain't moving faster with the further south we've been. And we never could land safely with that tangential gradient. So here's a lesson for who's listening. It's dynamics that are true. No kinematic concept could ever substitute. So the next time you are flying, no matter where you go, don't worry about rotation, cause we ain't on no damn globe. So here's a lesson for who's listening. It's dynamics that are true. No kinematic concept could ever substitute. So the next time you are flying, no matter where you go, don't worry about rotation, cause we ain't on no damn globe. Hidden in the winds, Coriolis just ain't hidden in these winds. And the Earth ain't moving faster with the further south we go. So thank God we won't be crashing when those wheels hit down below. Hidden in the winds, there ain't no Coriolis hidden in the winds. And thank God it's stationary, or we never safely land on a surface that is moving with a tangential gradient. Yes, here's a lesson for who's listening. It's dynamics that are true. No kinematic concept could ever substitute. So the next time you are flying, no matter where you go, don't worry about rotation, cause we ain't on no damn globe. Hidden in the winds, Coriolis just ain't hidden in these winds. And their Earth ain't moving faster with the further south we've been. And thank God we won't be crashing when we touch down at the end. Earth is stationary, we never safely land on a surface that is moving. There's no tangential gradient.
We can start at the equator. We've got 1,000 miles an hour, and let's say we're going to the North Pole, and that takes us 11 hours, say, or 10 hours for the simplicity of the maths. So over that 10 hours, we've got to drop 1,000 miles an hour of tangential velocity, which on average is 100 miles an hour every hour, which is only 1 or 2 miles an hour every minute. It's a very small acceleration, right? That can be provided by the drag force from the wind. So we'll assume that same deal, that there's a perfectly still Earth. There's no wind. The air and the ground move in sync. So the pilot will just fly. He'll be following his ground track, but there'll be an almost imperceptible side wind that over every hour adds a little bit to his speed from the outside, but to the ground speed it adds nothing, which is why he doesn't see it. Where we are now is we have an aircraft flying around above an Earth that is moving at 1,000 miles an hour compared to somebody else's perspective, and we agree he can do it. He should be able to do it with no problems, right? Because we can actually prove this by doing a drone flight in an aircraft at 1,000 miles an hour. The drone makes no compensation for the fact the aircraft is moving. So now we'll look at it in the globe Earth case. Let's assume that we've taken off at the equator and we've got this rotational velocity of 1,000 miles an hour compared to this external observer that sees everything rotating at 1,000 miles an hour. Aircraft can't tell the difference in this case because the angular speed is very low. It might as well be on that flat stationary plane because everything is rotating together at 1,000 miles an hour. So it takes off, sits there, flies around, comes back to land, independent of what that velocity, tangential velocity is, right? Because he's never separated from the ground speed by more than his flight speed. So he can just do what he likes and lands where he likes, as though everything was stationary. So there is that it's not in pure lockstep. It almost is. The Earth in general is moving with the Earth. The wind velocity is the difference between that ideal fixed air and the motion of the Earth. That's what wind is. Wind is relative velocity between the ground and the air. The fundamental idea in physics, Geo, that if you're traveling along at a constant velocity and think you're traveling at a constant velocity, you can't be aware of what your true absolute velocity is. That all you can know is that you're traveling relative to some other thing at a certain speed, at a constant velocity. So flying around at the North Pole, all you can know is that you've got a certain speed compared to the ground. That's your only reference. If it was rotating really fast and you had an acceleration because of the rotation, a high acceleration, you'd know because acceleration is detectable. But linear velocities, which is what we're dealing with here, right? Linear velocities effectively because the thing's so big that we've been talking about potentially. So you're traveling at the North Pole. Someone on the outside that can see the Earth rotating can see that you've got a relatively small rotation, a small velocity compared to their inertial view. You get to the equator, that external observer that can see the equator rotating sees you now have a higher velocity, but from your perspective, you can't tell because your velocity compared to the ground is the only reference you have. You cannot tell that you're traveling any faster than you were at the pole. No, not only does it appear to be stationary relative to you, that every point on Earth is literally stationary relative to you. There's no change in its position relative to you.
So